It is October 28th, 2015. I am Camila Martin, Assistant Professor of African American Literature in the Department of English, Language, and Cultures at Savannah State University. I am here with Dr. Antonio D. Tillis. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So
Dr.
please tell us who you are and a little bit about what you do.
Okay. As Camila said, Dr. Martin said, I'm Dr. Antonio Tillis. I am currently Dean of the School of Languages, Cultures, and World Affairs at the College of Charleston, where I am also a full professor of Hispanic Studies. My academic areas are Afro-Latin American literature, African diaspora literature, as well as Latin American literature and cultural studies.
Right. Wonderful, wonderful. So today at Savannah State University, you delivered a public lecture entitled Writing the African Diaspora Experience. This is a very broad topic.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us briefly how your research and professional experience fit under that umbrella?
Yes. First of all, my published work has to do with writings by Latin Americans of African ancestry principally. And what I learned from reading their novels, their short stories, their expository writing, is the ways in which they used just that, the power of writing and the artistry and process of writing in a very revolutionary way. And what I mean by a very revolutionary way is that they use writing in order to write themselves and their community back into the national narratives of their nation. Today, as you note, I did give a lecture talking about three writers in particular, one from the Dominican Republic, Blas Jimenez, one from Cuba, Nancy Marijon, and a writer from Brazil, Conceição Evaristo, showing the revolutionary aesthetics that are in their writings and how their writing is very propagandistic in the sense that it is for a socio-political purpose.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. So let's talk a little bit more about this term Afro-Latino. Mm-hmm. When defining that term, who or what does that include? And why not simply use the term Hispanic as a catch-all phrase?
Got it, very good. Typically, these typologies, Hispanic, Latino, Afro-Latino, Chicano, Chicana, they're all born out of some type of political, socio-political ether. Afro-Hispanic is typically born out of the desire of folk in Latin America who celebrate their African ancestry and want to celebrate themselves as people of African descent. Many folks typically say that this is a typology that is hegemonically placed onto this community by Latin American scholars, principally Latin American scholars from the United States. In my writings, when I use the term, I only use it for those people who consider themselves. And so these are folk who I have heard reference themselves as Afro-Latin American, or even in Conceição's stint, Afro-Brazilian. So to be politically correct, for those who I don't know where they fit along that politicized continuum, I would say a person of African ancestry in Latin American of African ancestry, as opposed to affixing Afro to it. So it's politicized. A lot don't, Hispanic is not broad enough to cover it all, because first of all, when you deal with the politics of quote unquote that typology Hispanic, it indicates primarily only people of Spanish speaking. And so you don't encompass one of the largest geographical tapestries of Latin America, which is Brazil. Brazilians are not Hispanic.
Right.
And so that's one way of differentiating that we're not talking about a monoglot when we're dealing with Latin America, because we have folk who speak French, folk in some parts who speak Dutch, and also probably a huge population that speak Portuguese and that are not Hispanic.
Okay, wonderful. So when students think about foreign language and culture, Spanish in particular, they often overlook the significance or influence of Africa. What would you say gets lost in translation when students fail to recognize that people of African descent have also populated the Hispanic-speaking world?
Absolutely. That's a very good question. And I think that's where our education system has, there are many ways we talk about how our education system has not done justice to educating our children and our young people properly. But when we talk about the history of, quote unquote, the transatlantic transfer, we don't teach it relative to the totalities of the Americas and what was happening relative to colonialism in the totality of the Americas. And therefore, students grow up thinking that the transatlantic transfer is something that's only unique to the United States of North America. And they don't venture beyond the borders, south of the borders, to think about the implications of black bodies during that period in places like Mexico, which now, you hear people say there are no blacks in Mexico, when we all know that Mexico has its history of domestic slavery in the day in other spaces. So I say, as a short answer to your question, that, again, only when we begin to dislodge our historical silos and to look at these major movements and shifts of people and the dispersal of these people. Many folk don't even know that Brazil has the second highest population of folk of African ancestry within our hemisphere. A lot of people don't know that Colombia has as many folk of African descent as the United States, Venezuela, and others. And so these are the way, when we teach this comparatively, our students see a broader contextualization of this notion of Latin America and people of African ancestry in Latin America. And the question will become, how did they get there? And then you can circle all the way back to the history of the transatlantic transfer.
Right. Okay. Great. What first led you to master the Spanish language? And secondly, to then explore Afro-Latino literature and culture more specifically?
Spanish, my Aunt Sheila. She is totally the culprit.
Okay.
When I was a little boy, she was in high school learning Spanish, and she taught me how to count to 10. And I had not begun school yet, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever. And so I never forgot how to count to 10. And so when I got to high school, I went to a school of academics, so we had to choose areas of concentration, and Spanish was one of mine. I did not think that I would become a professor. As I shared with the students earlier, at Vanderbilt University, I was training to become an international lawyer. This is when the North Atlantic, the treaties of North America was happening with South America and other Spanish-speaking places. So I thought that I was going to delve into that arena as an international attorney. Didn't go to law school, worked, as I shared with the students earlier today. I was living in Washington, D.C. Howard University advertised a lecture of Blas Jimenez and this whole concept of race and blackness in the Dominican Republic, which was new to me. Went to the lecture, totally revolutionized my thinking, my whole worldview. And after that, I consequently left corporate America and went to graduate school.
Wonderful. So you have an impressive publication record and a good bit of editorial experience. What are some of the challenges of scholarly writing in a second or third language?
Yeah, I would have to say stylistic and also content, in the sense that, to your first question, this whole notion of understanding the development of this body of scholarship called Afro-Latin America, and that it is that. I mean, we are trained to understand the tapestries of these geographical spaces in which we work. And the biggest challenge is when folk who are not trained in the area try to write about the area using U.S.-based paradigms of race and racialized understandings that don't work in Brazil, that don't work in Cuba, that don't work in Argentina. And so when I receive papers from sociologists, because the journal is an interdisciplinary journal and multidisciplinary journal, so when I receive papers from sociologists who are looking at the ways in which the Afro-Latino is defining and creating him or herself within the United States, and they try to leap onto the national territories from which their subjects come, there's a huge cultural synapse that occurs. And so I have to go back to these authors, say, I think this paper is great, however, I suggest that you read this to frame this and to contextualize this. And it's not only myself, I have a wonderful editorial board who too are trained, and so they do the same type of work.
Okay, all right. Okay, so let's go back in your history a little bit. Do you remember the first research paper you wrote in a foreign language, and what was that experience like? Kind of mastering.
Well, actually, the
writing.
first research paper I ever wrote in a foreign language, I wrote as an undergraduate student back at Vanderbilt University. Okay. And my God, I thought that was the toughest thing I had ever done in my entire life. Dr. Martin, if you can imagine, reading things in Spanish, reading things in English, trying to make the language and the movement of the English fit the language and the movement of Spanish, making sure that I'm using contextually the right words in Spanish. That was a huge challenge. Writing for my Latin American literature class back at Vanderbilt University, studying with the great Dr. Enrique Pupa Walker, a very renowned Latin Americanist.
So following up, how would you describe the process you engage in when undertaking a writing project of any kind, now having years of experience?
Absolutely. For me, when I delve into a new project, the first thing that I do is, interestingly, the title.
I can relate.
And this is why I tell my students when I teach, we don't start with the first page of the book. We start with the title and the deconstruction of the title to try to understand what it is that the author is trying to give to us by means of the title. So I start with the title, and then that title leads me to the different bodies of scholarship that's available for if I'm doing something that's theoretical, that has to do with, for instance, the book that I'm writing now has to deal with rewriting from a standpoint of using the discipline of geography. And I'm redefining corporal cartography, looking at in ways in which the body engages geographical spaces that we find within a novel. So it takes me back to understanding cartographic study and geography studies, studies of the body in politics, the body in motion. So as we read these texts and we see these protagonists and antagonists shifting from geographical locations that call for a different type of political performance from these bodies, just to see how the bodies manipulate and create a sense of self within these spaces. So from the title, go from the title to the different areas of scholarship that I need in order to write, and then somehow trying to pull it all together.
Okay. Which probably involves a bit of translation, I would imagine.
A lot of translation. You're absolutely right, because if I'm writing for a U.S. audience that has not the facility in Portuguese, I'll use that as an example, that I always like to leave the original text, such that I think it's important that when we do translated works that we leave the original text and then have the English translation, there. Some things you can't translate. That's the challenge. Right. And working with Conceição Evaristo, who speaks a regional dialect from Minas Gerais. And for instance, whenever they say, I'll give you an example. When you're in a conversation, they use a word called trem. And train can be any and everything. So it all depends on the context. So there's really it's not a literal translation of a train. I mean, it's contextualized, and that's the beauty of language, that it can be whatever it is that we need it to be regionally or within an in-group communicative form.
Which really kind of preempted my next question. I was going to ask about, how does one, for instance, convey the poetics of Nensei Morejon into English without losing the beauty of the piece? What makes a good translation?
understanding the nuances of intercultural translation. That it is not just the process of seeing which word closely approximates from the Spanish into the English,
Right.
from the Portuguese into the English, from the French, from the German, Russian into the English. No, because those words are connotative. They have power. Right. They have connotative meaning, not just denotative meanings. And oftentimes we, as translators, we have to be very, very cognizant of understanding the word choice going from one language into another, because it's going, and I tell students all the time, language is culture. So when you're using language, you're going from one cultural set into another, and you've got to make sure that there's an approximation, that you keep not just the socio-historical approximation, but poetic devices, alliteration, onomatopoeia. You have to think about all of this if it's, because you don't want to lose that coming from one stylistic presentation of poetry in a language going into another stylistic presentation.
Absolutely. I was also going to point to Alejo Carpentier's
Yes.
Kingdom of this World
El Reino de este Mundo.
as another example of how translation can go wrong. The English translation is just tedious. You can tell that it has not been, the original has not been captured well in
Sure.
the English version.
And what you're feeling also, Dr. Martin, is something that we call, in our world, writing from without as opposed to writing from within. And that a lot of people say, you know, what Carpentier wrote relative to his reimagining of Haiti and the Haitian Revolution in that piece is just that. His reimagining of Haiti and the Haitian Revolution from the standpoint as if he were an ethnographer. And I think, to your point, that's the distancing that you feel. And that he's writing from without, as if he were a cultural ethnographer looking into that epic of history and then creating a narrative surrounding it, as opposed to being from that community, writing the narrative about that community.
Right. So speaking of Carpentier, I have to ask about his term, L'Oreal Maravilloso. Yes! As a scholar of Afro-Latino literature, how do you define this concept for your students?
Yes.
Is it the same thing as employing magic realism in creative writing?
It totally is not.
Okay.
When we look at Gabriel Garcia Marquez and his fictional creation of Macondo in Cien Años de Soledad, and again, when we look at the notion of the utilization of magic realism, you are talking about that. You're talking about magic. You're talking about principles based on a Todorovian notion of the fantastic. When you look at works like El Reino de este Mundo and others that come from a vein of Lo Real Maravilloso, or you're looking at a loosely translation of the marvelously real, in the sense that there is a cultural connection, a cultural belief of what is happening within these texts. So it is not fantastic. It is not from the Todorovian stance of anything, that these are typically culturally religious-based occurrences that the people have as a part of their cosmology, and therefore, again, it is not anything that's magic in that sense.
Right. Wonderful. Very, very well spoken. Thank you for that. All right. So what opportunities or life experience has your research and writing afforded you that perhaps would not be available without the study of foreign language?
Travel.
Absolutely.
International conferences, collaboration with international scholars, experiences that I call anthropologic experience that we're going to talk about here on tape, and others. I tell you, when I shifted from the corporate world to come into the academic world to study comparatively Latin American culture, and then looking at indigeneity, looking at roles of women, looking at other themes, it's been very fruitful relative to understanding people, and really, from my own standpoint, expanding my global knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've given conferences at African Diaspora conferences. I've given talks, conferences organized in Sweden,
Mm-hmm.
China,
Mm-hmm.
all over the world. So it's just amazing to see that globally, in spaces that we would never imagine, that there are conversations happening about Latin America,
Right.
and particularly conversations about Latin Americans of Afro descendancy.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. And what final thoughts would you like to leave with our listeners?
Well, I would say if you don't speak a language, learn one. If you haven't visited a space outside of the U.S. and you have the economic means to do so, do it. If you have not the economic means, there's YouTube, there's the World Wide Web, there are movies. Engage a geographical space outside of yourself, and I think that will help you to better understand yourself and your culture.
All right. Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you, Dr. Tillis. It was
Thank
a
you, Dr.
pleasure.
Martin.